Okay, so yeah, I already introduced myself before, so I won't do that again. But I'm also here to give a very short talk on inline styles. And my goal is to convince you that maybe, at least in theory, inline styles could be all we need to style our React apps. Now, to give you some context, I want to start with a very brief history of styling the web. And it begins almost 30 years ago when CSS was introduced. And then, for the first time, we were able to style our documents in a structured way. Then 10 years later, we got Sass and other preprocessors, bringing us variables, nesting, and much more, introducing many features that would later be added to CSS itself. Then in 2009, Yandex published BEM, which became the most public methodology for writing CSS at scale. And then fast forward to 2015, we got CSS Modules, which for the first time used the bundler to make our styles accessible in JavaScript. And just for reference, since this is a React meetup, React was released in 2013. So this was almost 2 years after the initial release of React. And then shortly after CSS Modules in the same year, we had the first CSS-in-JS libraries popping up, doing something that was very controversial at the time, which was moving our styles directly into the JavaScript code base. And then finally, there it is. Finally, in 2019, Tailwind 1.0 was released, which for the first time, I think, popularized the utility-first approach to CSS. Or not the first time, but the first mainstream one. Did we get it? Yep. And yeah, now the question for today is what comes next? And at this point, you might be wondering, what does all of this have to do with React at all? So let's talk about React first. When React was released, it introduced a shift in how we think about building apps. And for the first time, we thought in terms of components, not in pages. And this sparked a very interesting question, which was, how do we style our components? Because CSS is global, after all, and it doesn't quite fit with this component-based approach. And that question eventually led to the creation of CSS Modules and CSS-in-JS libraries as well. And then, back in the days, I also wrote my own CSS-in-JS library in 2016, like everyone did back then. I think there are like 200 different libraries out there. And I think it was the first one that popularized this idea of style as a function of state, which is very close to the idea of UI as a function of state, which we heard in the previous talk. Along with many other features like auto-prefixing, automatic right-to-left conversion, theming support long before CSS variables were available in all browsers, and a lot of things. And basically, I've been using it for almost 8 years, and it literally solved all my problems that I had with styling in React. Until it didn't, which is, the question of today. So what happened then? And well, React Server Components happened. We talked about it in the short dinner break as well. React Server Components changed a lot of things. And it was already in 2022 when Next.js version 13 was released, and with it, the first experimental implementation of React Server Components. And it's been a bumpy ride since then, but nowadays, React Server Components are more and more popular these days, and people actually start using it, and it works. And I don't want to go into the details, because this is about styling, after all, but what React Server Components did, it was introducing a very new layer of complexity when it comes to how we render our React apps, because now all of a sudden we have those two environments. And now if you combine that with streaming rendering, which also came roughly at the same time, you run into a lot of issues with common CSS-in-JS libraries, but especially with those that use runtime CSS like Fella that I've been using up until now. And that then obviously led me to the question, what now? So I wanted to use React Server Components because I wanted to use like the latest features and so on, but I also didn't want to lose the convenience that I had with Fella. And now that's the point where most people would say, just use Tailwind. Everyone uses Tailwind, right? Everyone loves Tailwind. The thing is, I don't like Tailwind. I'm used to the ergonomics of Fella, and I simply hate this whole string thing. I can't explain it otherwise. So it got me thinking, and eventually, after a long time of thinking, I thought about inline styles again. And I had this question popping up in my head, which was, what if only inline styles had support for things like pseudo-classes, media queries, container queries? Wouldn't that be all we need? And I think, actually, I probably wouldn't even have written filler in the first place, and maybe we wouldn't have written CSS-in-JS at all in the first place if we could just use inline styles. And as it turns out, I'm not the only one. Even people like the authors of Tailwind think the same way. So they wouldn't have done Tailwind if inline styles could do all of that. Which got me interested in inline styles again. And there's some exciting news. So according to Leah Veroux from the CSS working group, they actually plan to have native browser support eventually, but unfortunately it's not very trivial to implement, so it will take more time. And well, this was 2 years ago, as you can see at the bottom, and there's still no update. So we are back at the start, which is Tailwind the only solution that we have? Well, maybe not. And that's where I want to introduce CSS hooks. CSS hooks is a very small library around inline styles, and it uses a very neat CSS variable trick to support pseudo-classes, media queries, and more. It has no compiler, no CSS output, just pure inline styles. And thus, it works perfectly fine with React Server Component streaming and all the new React features. Because the name is a bit confusing, it has nothing to do with React hooks. I don't like the name too much, but it is what it is. Now, let me show you how this whole trick works. So CSS variables support a primary and a fallback value that you can provide. And the spec has a couple of rules when it comes to how those values are applied. And there are two specific ones that we need to take a look when it comes to this whole CSS variable trick. Okay, so the first one is when the primary value is set to initial, then the fallback value will always be used because initial in the spec is considered an invalid value. And then the second one, if it's an empty value, then the empty value will actually be used because that one is a valid value, even though this empty value has no effect on the declaration in the end. And this might look very weird, but we need to understand how this works to actually understand the trick that's going on. Now, we can combine those two rules, and that's basically what the trick does, because we can compare two variables to toggle between arbitrary fallback values depending on some kind of condition. In this case, it's hover, but you can use any kind of matching selector or add rule. And I know this might look a bit confusing, but just trust me, it works. I'll show you how it looks with the actual library. And the thing is, using this trick, we can implement almost every selector and add rule, making it an actual serious contender to other solutions. And the best part is, it's striked out. We can nest variables indefinitely, creating all kinds of nested conditions as well if you want to. The problem is, this is completely cumbersome to write, and it quickly becomes unreadable. Even this one, in my opinion, is unreadable. And that's where CSS hooks comes in. It has a very simple API where you provide all the states that you want to be using, and it gives you the simple CSS function that you also know from other CSS-in-JS libraries, which basically converts your style object to the aforementioned CSS variable syntax under the hood. And all of this comes with TypeScript support and autocompletion, so you basically get the same experience, if not way better than you get with Tailwind. And since it's all just runtime JavaScript, I was able to bridge all of the filler ergonomics I used before with just a very thin layer on top of CSS hooks. If you want to check it out, it's called Brandeur, and you can use all the existing filler plugins as well. And to finish off, of course, like everything in life, it comes with some drawbacks and pitfalls, and I just want to be fair and mention them. There are basically two big pitfalls that I know of. The first one is pseudo-elements, such as after, before, and so on, don't work. And if you want to use those, you have to fall back to CSS, unfortunately. But I happen to realize you rarely use those in apps, in my opinion. And the second one is you don't have the scanner selectors, because inline styles always only affect the element they are rendered to. So you can't target other elements around it. But on the other hand, you get this parent selector, at least I call it parent selector, which CSS doesn't have by default. So it's actually more about rethinking the boundaries than a lack of capability, in my opinion. And now to finish off with a quick conclusion. So in my opinion, even if it's not a perfect solution, it's definitely a great alternative, especially if you hate Tailwind and you want to have this native JavaScript object kind of feel. And you can do almost everything that you can do with traditional CSS-in-JS libraries, minus the added complexity and the overhead. And in fact, I use it in multiple apps already. And yeah, I'm really happy with it. It works great so far. And the good thing is maybe, just maybe, in the future, we will even get native browser support, so we can just strip the whole extra layer and just use the native one. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening.